I don't know why many people in the United States have to see concretely something. I mean, sanctions, although you don't see them on a wall or in a room, I mean, they cause as much death as a war. It's like declaring a state of siege in medieval times against a city or whatever, just blocking it up. I mean, these type of sanctions, you can stop all medicine, you can stop gas, you can stop everything from going into a country with these sanctions. Even during siege time, there were laws regulating what you could do. And now, I mean, you can squeeze a country and destroy the country without any limits. At least that's what the United States thinks they can do. So the only mechanism of defense is multilateralism.
For years, the United States has been targeting the small Central American nation of Nicaragua for regime change. A violent U.S.-backed coup attempt in 2018 was only the latest in a series of aggressive actions aimed at overthrowing its leftist Sandinista government. Nicaragua is also one of dozens of countries suffering under unilateral U.S. sanctions, which are illegal under international law and which have taken a serious toll on the country's economy. In the capital Managua, I sat down for an interview with Carlos Argüello, Nicaragua's representative at the United Nations International Court of Justice. Argüello spoke about his country's attempts to hold Washington accountable for its aggression against his country and the importance of multilateral institutions in giving a voice on the international stage to small nations like Nicaragua.
It's not perhaps very well known that the country that has had most cases in the International Court is the United States, 23 cases the last time. And the second country is Nicaragua, 15 cases. After that comes the UK, France, and then lower down. So Nicaragua, let's say, for a small country, has been very active at the multilateral level in the International Court of Justice. But I think the multilateralism is alive. Of course, a great power like the United States is doing a lot of damage, but there are many other countries that believe in multilateralism and are keeping the spirit alive. So the mechanisms are there. The United Nations is active. Of course, without the assistance of the United States, it's always a big problem. The United States is one of the biggest financial backers of these institutions. So what's going to happen is other nations will have to take up the slack. I mean, Nicaragua believes in international law. In fact, we have done so for many years. As I say, we have the most cases in the International Court. But obviously, with the United States, and that's the experience we had, not with Mr. Trump, it was in the 1980s with President Reagan. I mean, he simply ignored the court. The court gave the judgment. The United States paid no attention to it. We went to the Security Council, I'm talking about in the 1980s. The United States vetoed any decision, although it was in its own, it was an interested party, and yet the veto progressed. So, I mean, the United States has always been putting, blocking international institutions when they don't favor its perceived interests. So this is not a new point. Perhaps now it is being talked about more openly in the United States, but my experience has been that the United States has always acted, has respected law when they perceived it was in their interest. For example, in the 80s, my first experience of this was Nicaragua had an extradition treaty with the United States dating back from 1907. And when we toppled the Somoza dictatorship, well, we invoked the treaty, and we went to the State Department. We did everything that they told us we had to do. And then came the election of Mr. Reagan in November 1980, and that was the end of it, period. The treaty was not valid. I mean, it wasn't invoked. And then they revoked it, period. So it was valid until the point when the United States thought it was their interest. We went to the International Court of Justice in the 80s. There was a treaty, an agreement. The United States had accepted the jurisdiction of the court. The statute of the International Court is part of the Charter of the United Nations. So it's as important and as valid as any article of the Charter of the United Nations. And simply the United States ignored it. So this has happened in the past. And now at present, I mean, what's happening is that they are making it more obvious. They're not even trying to hide the intent. But naturally, I think for the world, and certainly for the smaller countries, international law and international organizations are the only way to survive in this world. So in Nicaragua, we are wholeheartedly interested in maintaining the multilateralism and the institutions that exist up to this moment, and in bolstering them as much as possible.
In the 1980s, Nicaragua took the United States to the International Court of Justice over its support for a terrorist war aimed at toppling the socialist government in Managua. Ambassador Carlos Argüello recalled this history which he was involved in and whose legacy very much lives on in Nicaragua today, although it is not well remembered in North America.
When Mr. Reagan came into power in 1981, in fact, when he took office, he immediately had a directive authorizing the financing of the Contra war of an army, a real army, against Nicaragua. This began escalating until we reached the point in 1983 when they bombed the port of Corinto in Nicaragua, where 20,000 people live. They burned up all the petrol, the thousands of millions of gallons of petrol in the tanks there, in the deposits, endangering the population. And this was done directly by the United States. This was done by Argentinian military people under the pay of the United States. It's a very ironic name they were given, these type of individuals, that you can find it in dictionaries. In the judgment of the court, they also mentioned, they are called the UCLAs, unilaterally controlled Latin assets. These were the ones that, and the court mentions it. That's the name. The UCLA is a special type of university. They attacked it directly from motherships by the United States Navy. They sent these guys. This was in October of 1983. It coincided more or less. It was a few days before the United States invaded the island of Grenada, which was also one of the things that we were analyzing here in Nicaragua. There was President Ortega, at the time Father Escoto, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And one of the things that called their attention was practically no newspaper in the United States mentioned the fact that it was illegal. The invasion of Grenada was illegal. I mean, went against international law, as if international law had nothing to do with it. So this was building up. And then in January 1984, February, they mined Nicaraguan ports. I mean, this was something that astounded the world, because even when you have open warfare, you're supposed to tell the world, well, we have mined the ports, not to endanger the shipping. The United States didn't tell anybody. Several ships were damaged. And by the way, all of these things were not, they were called covered, but they were very open. When they asked President Reagan about the mines, he said, well, why are they complaining? They are small mines. When they talked about the Corinto, he said, well, I believe that a country, when it's in its own interest, can practice covert operations. So I mean, there was nothing hidden about this. In Congress, the assistance, the financial assistance and all that for the Contra forces was openly discussed. There was a discussion, mostly the Republicans with Mr. Reagan were in favor of the aid to the Contras, and the Democrats were against it, but it was discussed openly. There was nothing hidden about it. And by the way, perhaps I should go back a few years. where we got the idea, one of the places where the idea of going to the court originated was precisely the activities of the United States. When the United States had problems in Iran and the hostages were taken by the students in Iran, the United States took Iran to the International Court of Justice and said that this was the civilized way in which nations should resolve their disputes. But this was in 1979, the court gave its judgment in 1980. So we had this, let's say, precedent. So if this is the civilized way, well, you said, let's go to the court. So we took the United States to the court. The court almost unanimously, when we requested provisional measures, almost unanimously, in every way, including the American judge at that point, were saying that the United States should cease these operations. And then, since the United States said that the court was not the appropriate forum to discuss these issues and all that, then we had to discuss the question of admissibility and jurisdiction. And the United States participated. They had a brigade of lawyers there. They did everything that, and when the court decided that there was jurisdiction, then the United States said, no, we're not going to participate anymore. And the reason was very obvious, not because they didn't trust the court. It was a matter because everything was open. I mean, we didn't have to go around looking under the table for proof. The president had recognized what they were doing. It was being openly discussed in Congress. So, I mean, there was nothing to do. That's what the United States would do. If they had certainty that they were going to win, they would have remained. So it was simply what they perceived as their own interest. It was, frankly, an open and shut case. But the judgment was given in 1986. The United States ignored it. The court indicated that the United States should pay compensation for all the damages caused to Nicaragua. And so, but that was going to be analyzed in a different phase of the case. And so we presented our memorial on damages. That was in 1989. The United States didn't react. But then came a change of government in Nicaragua, and the new government was convinced that the United States was going to give it a lot of assistance, and part of the idea was that the case should be withdrawn. So the case was discontinued in the court. I mean, but one point that we should, I should make very clearly is that Nicaragua didn't renounce the compensation. The only thing that happened in that moment was that we discontinued what was going on in the court. That's the extent of it. But morally and legally, the United States is still liable for paying that compensation to Nicaragua. I mean, it was 10 years of war, of thousands of troops fighting against Nicaragua, all the damage that was done. Not only, I'm speaking only, let's say, on the use of force in particular, but there were other elements. Because, I mean, the first thing that the United States did when Reagan came in was to block in all the multilateral institutions, financial institutions, to block all loans for Nicaragua. And it was done by a letter. I mean, it was officially, they sent that the United States will veto any loans to Nicaragua. Now they are doing it in other ways, more hidden. But then they did it quite openly. It was simply no loans to Nicaragua. So let's say the financial attacks against countries is something of long-standing. I mean, it's not something that the United States has been doing very frequently. Now, of course, the mechanisms have been improved, and they are doing it with effects outside the United States. In the 1980s, the United States also decreed an embargo against Nicaragua because it was supposedly Nicaragua represented an enormous danger for the security of the United States, which of course was, I mean, but when you read it, that's what it's the only way they could have done it. I mean, they have to say this is a especially difficult and dangerous situation for the United States. But anyway, the situation continued, of course, with the new government that came into power in Nicaragua in the 1990s, didn't really get any aid from the United States. I mean, they stopped blocking international institutions, but to say that the real financial aid was given, it never happened. It never happened. It was just an imaginary carrot that was placed in front of the government. And the country was really in ruins. I mean, you can imagine a small country like Nicaragua after 10 years of practically an all-out and out war with incredible things. Imagine, it's part of the record. I mean, all law students that study international law, one of the main cases they study is this case. If you go and read the case, one of the things you'll come up to is something that must have shocked the judges. The CIA had prepared a manual for the Contra forces, a manual of what they should do to terrorize the population, that they should kill certain people in a small town, kidnap, and do a lot of things, even hire criminals to do things. And this was proven, I think it's on the record, that it was prepared by the CIA. Because in the records, in the congressional records of the United States, they mentioned this publication as being prepared by the CIA. So you can imagine not only financing, directing, and doing everything, and preparing a manual of creating terrorism in Nicaragua. I mean, the extent to which these operations went is incredible. You know, as I said, there was an opposition in Congress between the Democrats and the Republicans on the financing. So finally, in 1985, officially, the finance was stopped. And of course, that was the impression given to the international court. Well, the financing is stopped, but it never stopped. What happened was that the United States was authorizing selling drugs, drug traffickers, making deals underhand with Iran, which was the enemy number one for getting money, selling weapons to Iran. I mean, all this came out in the congressional records afterwards. In the question of the drugs, there was a commission, a Senate commission headed by Mr. Kerry, the former Secretary of State. He was a senator at that time, in which they came to a conclusion, I mean, within the limits that obviously you're talking about your own country, within the limits that, yes, the United States have been involved in these operations with drugs. And then you have, for example, Mr. Elliot Abrams, who is now in charge of Venezuela. Mr. Abrams was accused for lying to Congress because he was in charge of the operation with Iran and other countries, of getting illegal financing for the Contras. So, in fact, I mean, the operation continued. It was really a fraud also for the court, because even the court was under the impression when they gave the judgment in 1986 that the financing to the Contras had ceased. It never stopped. So, I mean, the United States was officially going against the law, unofficially also doing everything possible, incredible things, to destroy a very small country. So, I mean, this is going back to the 80s. And now, what's happening now? Now we're beginning in the same way as it was in the early 80s with the financial coercion against Nicaragua. The so-called NICA Act, the first thing that we have to remember is that the NICA Act did not come about because of any events that happened in Nicaragua 2 years ago. The NICA Act was already in Congress several years before that. It was during the Obama administration that this was brought to Congress, basically by Cuban Americans from Florida who were in Congress and in the Senate of the United States, who had a special interest in destroying Mr. Ortega. So this was preceded. So to say that the sanctions against Nicaragua are sort of a punishment for crimes committed, it has nothing to do with that. I mean, this began years before that. It was simply a way, they simply did not like the government of Nicaragua. They could not understand that the government was being very successful. It was Mr. Ortega who was in charge, and he was being successful, much more so than all the other before him. So this they couldn't stand. So the only way they could attack without going back to the Contra war, a sort of Contra war, was what happened in Nicaragua. with the NICA Act, and now, of course, this type of sanctions, the main damage they are doing is for the population. I mean, that's what always happens with these type of sanctions.
Given Washington's role in the 2018 coup attempt and other recent aggressive actions against Nicaragua, I asked Ambassador Argüello if they have considered reviving their case against the United States in the International Court.
And the thing is that the United States has withdrawn all its commitments for international justice. So every agreement or every treaty in which the United States had somehow accepted the jurisdiction of the court has been eliminated. So it would be very difficult, let's say, to bring a case against the United States in the International Court. They have sort of completely blocked it and withdrawn. As I say, that's not the only mechanism open. I mean, if there is an obligation of the United States, the obligation exists still. I mean, there are mechanisms that we have been studying. I mean, the United Nations as a system has a lot of possibilities. But at the moment, I mean, our main interest is not so much, from my point of view, in recovering the debt, the enormous debt that the United States has. I mean, our main interest is in peace. I mean, it's to leave us in peace and leave us alone. Nicaragua was doing very well. All the standards, the measurements in poverty, in criminality, in any type of Nicaragua was doing excellently well. We had mechanisms. The government was with the business people in Nicaragua working together, and with the workers reaching agreements, and everything was going very well. This was something that couldn't be stood by certain elements in the United States who wanted to destroy the government. So that's why they created the situation in 2018. I remember I was in Spain a couple of years ago giving a conference, and some of the students asked me about, because the situation was very recent at that point. But they had the problem in Catalonia, in Spain. So I asked them, listen, what do you think would happen if the Catalans all of a sudden blocked all communications with France, with the rest of Spain, and there were no trucks or no possibility of transfer for more than a month? Do you think that the military or the police in Spain would simply just cross their arms? He said, and by the way, no policeman in Catalonia has been killed. That, I say, is a very different situation from what is happening and what happened in Nicaragua. This was an attempt at a coup d'etat. And then with what happened with Chile, I also make the comparison. What happened in Chile? Well, the government of Chile didn't sit down and talk with them. They sent the army to start shooting them and blinding them and doing anything that. What happened in Nicaragua? President Ortega decided to sit down and talk. And the only thing that happened is they took to the streets, blocked everything, and that was it. If President Ortega had reacted like Chile and sent out the army or the police immediately and no conversations, I mean, this wouldn't have gotten very far. The only thing that happened is precisely because he was very open to conversations. He sat down with them, they insulted him in public, they did everything, and he very quietly took it for more than a month. All traffic between Central America, even from Mexico, was blocked. There were thousands of trucks waiting because they couldn't get through Nicaragua. They were even thinking of preparing a ferry to bypass Nicaragua, because everything coming from Panama, Costa Rica to the north had to pass through Nicaragua, and everything coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras had to pass through Nicaragua. Well, that was blocked during more than a month and a half. So, I mean, that situation, how can you react to it? You can't just say, okay, we'll continue. I mean, they talked for more than a month. So what else can you do? Just say, okay, we have to sit down. Because, by the way, another thing is, you can create this type of havoc with 1% of the population. If 1% of the population is 60,000 people, and there were less than 60,000 people in the streets. So, I mean, with a very small amount of people, you can create havoc. And if you just have one guy with a gun or whatever shoot a policeman, well, that's it also. In Chile, no policeman has been killed in Chile. In Nicaragua, there were about 25 or 30 policemen killed, and I don't know, a couple of hundred wounded. Seriously, not with rocks, with guns. And when you look back, you see that the people that were leading this coup d'etat in Nicaragua had been constantly going back and forth to the United States, meeting openly congressmen and people in the United States. So what can you deduce from that? Huh? These are people that have no way of living. They don't have any business, many of them, and they live very well. So where are they getting their funds? Huh? I mean, all that is a relative mystery. Huh? But I mean, that's the situation. This is, let's say, the new type of covered war that is being practiced against Nicaragua. This time a bit more covertly. But it's still, I mean, what we hope is that we don't continue an escalation like what happened in the 80s to reach limits, incredible limits, which that's one of the things we hope we can more or less maintain some reason. And the government continues trying to find ways of communicating with the United States and seeing how we can reach agreements. So hopefully that will happen. I mean, I'm frankly, I'm getting too old to begin another case in the court.
I asked Ambassador Argüello if there is any legal basis for the U.S. government's unilateral imposition of sanctions on Nicaragua and many other countries across the planet, and what those nations are trying to do to get around this economic coercion.
From a legal point of view, in public international law, obviously sanctions dictated by one country cannot have extraterritorial effects. I mean, any country can dictate a law. The United States is perfectly, it would be perfectly legal from an international point of view if the United States said, we don't accept any business with Nicaragua. We're not going to receive any goods from Nicaragua or allow any goods from the United States to go. But to apply that extraterritorially, this is to a bank that has any business with Nicaragua, even if it's based outside the United States or businesses like that, well, that you are trying to apply your internal law outside your country. That's illegal. That's an international illicit act. I mean, you can't be applying extraterritorially your law. I mean, it's a very clear violation. In fact, this has been created problems even with the partners of the United States, with the European Union, with a question with Iran. They're trying to find mechanisms, or we're trying to find mechanisms to avoid this, because I mean it's completely illegal. Your law, you dictate laws. Countries dictate laws for their own territory, for their own people, for their own country. But when you say this, that I'm saying this law here is going to apply everywhere in the world, well, I mean that's not true and that's not possible. That's the way the United States is acting. In the 80s, for example, with the attacks against Nicaragua, they didn't have any extraterritorial effects. The embargo against Nicaragua was bilateral. I mean, Nicaragua couldn't buy anything from the United States or sell anything in the United States, but we were open and many countries were helping Nicaragua, including the country where I'm based, the Netherlands, used to help Nicaragua a great deal. I mean, many European countries were helping Nicaragua. There was no problem. But these type of sanctions are frankly, we were recently celebrating the 87th birthday of the former foreign minister of Nicaragua, Father Scotto, who died a few years ago. And one of the things in which I remember speaking with him, and he visited me and we talked about it, was to talk about the past always, the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq after the first Iraq war. I mean, a few years of those sanctions, I mean, the records were that more than, I don't remember, 300,000 or 400,000 children. Exactly, children had died because of the sanctions.
So, the U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, said in an interview on 60 Minutes, she was asked, is the cost worth it? And she said, yes, we think the cost is worth it.
Well, frankly, she wanted to stop this interview because you left me without words. That frankly leaves one, I don't understand it. I mean,
we have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Well, anyway, the sanctions against Nicaragua, I mean, we are trying to, the government here is doing everything possible to try to avoid as much as possible to have a serious impact on the population. But obviously with the raising cost of many things, from gasoline to everything, that is impossible for a poor country like Nicaragua to be offsetting all the sanctions and all the problems that it's creating us. If we have to bring gasoline from 10,000 kilometers away, well, obviously the cost for everything in Nicaragua increases enormously. That has an enormous impact. So there are some things that, I mean, will certainly be causing serious problems in Nicaragua. As I say, the government is trying to distribute as much as possible the goods we have so that the population isn't too affected. But of course, the United States can increase. And if there is no limit put to what they are doing, at least in the 80s, we had a difference between Democrats and Republicans. Even within the United States, there was a discussion. I mean, this is illegal. What are we doing here? Huh? Nowadays, with sanctions, that hasn't the same effect because I don't know why many people in the United States have to see concretely something. I mean, sanctions, although you don't see them on a wall or in a room, I mean, they cause as much death as a war. I mean, it's like declaring a state of siege in medieval times against a city or whatever, just blocking it up. I mean, these type of sanctions, you can stop all medicine, you can stop gas, you can stop everything from going into a country with these sanctions. Even during siege time, there were laws regulating what you could do. And now, I mean, you can squeeze a country and destroy the country without any limits. At least that's what the United States thinks they can do. So the only mechanism of defense is multilateralism. I mean, a small country like Nicaragua, or even a big country like Russia, or a medium-sized power like Iran, cannot defend themselves alone. Huh? So what we need is for the international community to be aware. You can't be permitting a country to create this type of havoc in the economy all over the world. The sanctions, I mean, we have lived with sanctions in the past. It causes a lot of damage. Our only hope would be that the United States would come to a sense that it's ridiculous what they are doing with Nicaragua. Nicaragua is the safest country in Central America. I mean, the death by murder in Nicaragua are even lower than in Costa Rica, and a fraction of what is happening in the north. I mean, there's no invasion of our population going to the United States because they are flying away from maras or criminals like they are doing all over. The Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States knows perfectly well that Nicaragua blocks within its limits everything any traffic of drug that goes through this country. So, I mean, they're trying to destroy a country which, on the other hand, has, let's say, 10 in conduct, A plus in conduct. I mean, what are they looking for? I mean, if they begin attacking this and they create havoc in Nicaragua, what? Okay, well, there would be 100,000 Nicaraguans trying to go to the United States. The drug traffickers will get in. If the situation in 2018 had not been stopped, all the maras from El Salvador and Honduras would have come into Nicaragua. I mean, so what do they want? They want to destroy the country? I frankly don't see in whose benefit that is. Certainly not in the benefit of the United States. So hopefully the people in the United States in certain areas will come into their senses and say, well, come on, what are we doing here? This is absurd.
Many countries have criticized international bodies like the United Nations and its constituent organizations for being disproportionately manipulated by the United States. I concluded the interview asking Ambassador Argüello if he still believes that these institutions can truly ensure that the world is governed on a multilateral and not unilateral basis.
For me, the advantage of the international organizations is that you have people from all over the world. Talking about, let's say, my particular business, the International Court, you have 15 judges from all over the world. You have from Uganda to Russia, to, I mean, everywhere. Jordan. It's a multilateral organization. You have people from all ways of thinking, all parts of the world. So, on a balance, I mean, all human institutions are not perfect, obviously. But anyway, within what you can expect from human beings, I mean, you have a spectrum, a variety of ways of thinking, of different problems that they grew up with in their countries or whatever. So, and I think normally you can expect institutions that are integrated in that way to come up with something. Well, normally you're not going to say, well, either black or white, but I mean, they try to be balanced. At least in the International Court, it has been my experience. Obviously, if you go to certain other, the International Court is a principal organ of the United Nations in the same way that the Security Council is a principal organ of the United Nations. But of course, if you go to the Security Council, then that's a different situation. There, if that was the only multilateral organization, body, then I would completely agree. I mean, what are we doing there? If you have a veto, well, Russia will veto something, the United States will veto something else, the Chinese or the British or whatever. So, I mean, you never get any work done, any real work. But that doesn't happen in all the institutions. I'm a member, for example, of the Commission of International Law of the United Nations. There are 34 members from all over the world, lawyers. I mean, we have discussed all types of legal questions, and we reach agreements normally. We reach, normally everything is by consensus. So it comes out, and the International Law Commission has been doing a lot of work in its 70 years of existence. And many things have come from there. The law treaties, all matters of commerce. I mean, there have many institutions, many things very important. So I think multilateralism functions. I mean, you can just go back 100 years before anything but this began, and you can see the difference the way the world works now. I mean, perhaps the last century would have been different if we had had a United Nations at the end of the 19th century. But multilateralism didn't exist then. Was the world better off? Frankly, I can't imagine. I mean, multilateralism permitted you to send your mail with a postage stamp from here to Burundi in Africa. I mean, that didn't go by a miracle. It went through agreements, international agreements. I mean, we have to live by it. This is part of multilateralism. Everything we do now. What we do here affects everywhere else, and we need. So international law is the only way to survive. And multilateralism, let's say, is an expression of putting into force the international law.